Hello and welcome back in as we dive into part 3 of our notes on absolute monarchs as it relates to Europe. Today we'll dive in and we'll look a little bit about Prussia and Austria and how Central Europe looks as it relates to these monarchies. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind here is that there's lots of different conflict that is taking place at this point. As you have absolute monarchs that are trying to come to power, that means that there's lots of different fighting that takes place. The 30 Years' War is one of the best examples of this because it's basically this large war where you have a bunch of powers that are the kind of major players in Europe that fight at this time. Sweden, France, Spain, Austria, and Germany are all involved in this fighting. Why? It really comes down to again, the continued issues related to religion, but also over land and who controls land. The friction basically comes because the Germanic princes that control different territories there, as well as the Austrian emperor, they have disputes over who controls pieces of territory, and again, religious autonomy. These religious issues basically come from the fact that going all the way back to the Peace of Augsburg meant that the kings would decide, or the princes of their kingdoms would decide what religion they would practice. German Catholics get upset over this, that a prince could declare land Protestant, especially if they would decide that not even Lutheranism was too far, but that Calvinism could be present, which was seen as like a worst case scenario at the time. Protestants also worried about the rise of Austrian power. Mainly because the Austrian emperor was Catholic, and the thought was that if they expanded too much, that they may declare the land Catholic. So we see that because of this very large conflict over these issues, it's going to be a very long and bloody war where you look at about 8 million casualties all told. Essentially, the long and short kind of Cliff Notes version of this is the war itself takes a very long time, as well as a large toll on the populations that were fighting in these wars. But the main effect is through the Peace of Westphalia and what happens in Central Europe. Essentially, the peace, because of the Habsburgs' control, the alliance of other powers, such as the Prussians, the Swedes, the French, they end up being able to weaken Habsburg control over parts of Europe, especially the two areas that they controlled the most of was Spain and Austria. This also means that with their weakening, that France kind of can rise up as the main power in Europe. We also see that this essentially gives a lot more independence to the German princes that exist in Europe at this time, which means that they have much more freedom to make decisions and much more autonomy than they did in previous years and in previous lessons that we've talked about. This also effectively ends a lot of the religious fighting that we see in Europe from this point moving forward, that you don't have as much conflict between Catholics and Protestants moving forward. When you look at Prussia, though, Prussia is one of the good examples of these Central European absolute monarchs. Now, Prussia was a smaller princely kingdom in northern, what would be present-day Germany, under the House Hohenzollern, which was the Prussian royal family. And the king at that time, his name is Frederick, okay, and is often referred to as Frederick the Great. Why? Well, he was seen as a very effective ruler over the Prussian government. He believed that the government had a responsibility to provide for his people, so therefore, as the monarch, he had a need to provide for them. He was also deemed as a really great military leader, and this is only solidified with certain wars that are fought during this time. The War of Austrian Succession, as well as the 7 Years' War, lead to him being able to grow powers and his territory throughout Germany at that time. Just like we talked about with Louis, he is known for lessening the powers of the nobles unless they were tied to the military, because then, in a sense, they were still his subordinates and they were loyal to him in the way that the military was structured. They boosted their economy through industry and agriculture, as well as some colonization. There was large infrastructure programs, as well as the patronizing of the arts. And Prussia also becomes a state that is a little bit more religiously tolerant moving forward under Frederick as well. In Austria, you also have another example. Maria Theresa, she ends up taking the throne basically after her father allows women to rise to the throne. This power vacuum is able to be kind of fulfilled during or after the 30 Years' War. Austria's in a pretty difficult situation, though, mainly because they're in almost direct competition with Prussia often during these years. They had doubled the size of their army under her, mainly as a way of trying to compete during the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War that we talked about. And they're very vulnerable at this point in time because of the debt they incur from these wars, and 2 wars where they essentially lose power throughout Europe. Despite this, Maria Theresa is seen as very shrewd as an absolute monarch. She, just like we've talked about before with other examples, consolidates power, takes it away from the nobilities. She also is very interesting because, unlike what we talked about with Louis, with the tax system, she's able to use taxes and uses tax reform essentially as ways of trying to improve the lives of her subjects instead of trying to personally enrich herself, which still happens to an extent, but is done in a much more reformed and equitable way than, say, France. In Austria, they do not have as much religious autonomy, mainly because Maria Theresa sought to make sure that Roman Catholicism was strictly followed and that religious freedom was not allowed. The other big thing to keep in mind with Maria Theresa is kind of the legacy in which she uses her family to try to shore up political alliances. In total, she has 16 children and arranges a bunch of different marriages around Europe, basically as a way of trying to marry them off to solidify these alliances throughout Europe and to try to protect Austria. Next class, we'll talk a little bit more about Russia and their role in Europe as well. Europe and absolutism are a little bit different when we talk about Russia, but still we'll talk about them a little bit more in part 4. So thanks again for listening, and we'll dive back in next time.